The year was 1969, and America was at the height of the Cold War. Every shadow could hide a secret, every whisper could carry a truth the government didn't want you to know. In a small military base outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, a 24-year-old Air Force lieutenant named Robert Marcus Chen was about to witness something that would change his life forever. But unlike the heroes we celebrate, unlike the men who came home with medals and parades, Robert would never be allowed to share his story. Not with his family, not with the press, not with anyone. For 50 years, he carried a secret so dangerous that even mentioning it could mean disappearing without a trace. This is the story of what happened to Robert Chen and why the government made sure you would never hear his name. Robert grew up in Sacramento, California, the son of Chinese immigrants who ran a small grocery store on the east side of town. His father had served in World War II with the 492nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most decorated units in American history, and Robert grew up hearing stories of honor, duty, and sacrifice. When Robert turned 18 in 1963, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He joined the Air Force, determined to serve his country just like his father had. He was smart, disciplined, and by 1968 he had earned his commission as a second lieutenant. His superiors noticed his attention to detail, his ability to keep secrets, and most importantly, his unwavering loyalty. In January 1969, Robert received orders that puzzled him. He was being transferred to a classified research facility in the New Mexico desert, a place that didn't officially exist on any map. The orders were brief, stamped with so many security classifications that half the page was blacked out. All he knew was that he would be working on something called Project Sentinel, and that his security clearance had just been upgraded to a level he didn't even know existed. When Robert arrived at the facility in late January, the first thing that struck him was how ordinary everything looked from the outside. It could have been any military base in America, with rows of beige buildings, chain-link fences, and guards checking identification at the gate. But once you passed through those gates, once you went underground through the elevator that descended 7 floors beneath the desert floor, ordinary became something else entirely. The facility was massive, an underground complex that stretched for what seemed like miles. Robert learned that over 300 people worked there, scientists, engineers, military personnel, all sworn to absolute secrecy. His job, he was told, would be to coordinate logistics between different departments, to make sure equipment and materials moved where they needed to go when they needed to be there. It seemed simple enough. But Robert quickly realized that Project Sentinel was anything but simple. He began to notice patterns, strange deliveries arriving at odd hours, scientists speaking in hushed tones, stopping their conversations whenever someone without proper clearance walked by. And then there were the accidents. In his first month, Robert heard about 2 separate incidents where personnel had been injured in what were called equipment malfunctions. Both men were immediately transferred to an unknown location, and nobody was allowed to talk about what happened. Robert kept his head down and did his job. He had been trained not to ask questions, to trust that his superiors knew what they were doing. But in March of 1969, something happened that made it impossible to look away. Robert was doing a routine inventory check in one of the storage areas when he heard shouting coming from a restricted section he normally had no reason to visit. The voices were panicked, urgent. He heard someone yell about a containment breach, about needing to evacuate the wing immediately. His training told him to leave, to get to safety. But something else, maybe curiosity, maybe that sense of duty his father had instilled in him, made him move toward the commotion instead of away from it. What Robert saw in that restricted wing would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through a reinforced observation window, he witnessed 3 scientists in full protective suits surrounding something on a metal table. The thing on the table was moving, writhing in a way that didn't seem natural, didn't seem possible. It looked organic but wrong, like someone had taken the rules of biology and twisted them into something that shouldn't exist. The creature, if you could call it that, was about the size of a large dog, but its form kept shifting, appendages appearing and disappearing as if it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to be. Robert stood frozen, his mind trying to process what his eyes were seeing. One of the scientists looked up and saw him standing there. Their eyes met through the glass, and Robert saw something he would never forget. It wasn't anger at being observed. It wasn't fear of the creature they were trying to contain. It was pity. The scientist looked at Robert with the kind of pity you reserve for someone whose life is about to be destroyed. Within minutes, security personnel arrived. They didn't hurt Robert, didn't even raise their voices. They simply escorted him to a small office where a man in a dark suit was waiting. The man introduced himself as Agent William Crowley from a department that Robert had never heard of. Crowley explained that Robert had seen something he was never meant to see, something that officially didn't exist. Project Sentinel, Crowley told him, was developing defensive technologies against biological threats that America's enemies might deploy. What Robert had witnessed was a prototype, a test subject, nothing more. But the calm way Crowley spoke, the careful choice of words, told Robert that this explanation was itself a kind of containment. That evening, Robert was given new orders. He would continue his work at the facility, but he would never speak about what he had seen, not to his fellow officers, not to his family, not even in a private journal. If he ever broke his silence, Crowley made it clear the consequences would be severe, not just for Robert, but for everyone he cared about, his parents in Sacramento, his younger sister studying at Berkeley, everyone. Robert signed documents that night, papers that legally bound him to silence for the rest of his life. He had no choice. But as he lay in his bunk that night, unable to sleep, one question kept circling through his mind. If that thing on the table was a defensive prototype, why did it seem so alive, so aware, so terrified? Over the next 3 months, Robert tried to return to normal routine, to convince himself that what he had seen was exactly what Crowley said it was. But working at the facility became increasingly difficult. He started noticing things he had overlooked before. The way certain scientists looked exhausted, traumatized even, as if they were carrying a burden too heavy to bear. The way supplies were being ordered, not defensive equipment, but containment systems, restraints, things you would use on something you were trying to keep locked up rather than something you were building. In May, Robert befriended another lieutenant named David Harrison, a communications officer from Ohio who had been at the facility for almost a year. David had a wife and 2 kids back home, and he would show Robert pictures of them, talking about how much he missed them, how he couldn't wait for his rotation to end. One night, over coffee in the facility cafeteria, David leaned close and whispered something that made Robert's blood run cold. David said he had intercepted a transmission, something he wasn't supposed to hear, from a facility in Nevada. The transmission mentioned Project Sentinel by name, but it also mentioned something else. Multiple sites, multiple specimens, and most disturbing of all, it mentioned something called the Recovery Program. When Robert asked what that meant, David just shook his head. He said he had already said too much, that they needed to forget this conversation ever happened. But 2 days later, David didn't show up for his shift. Robert asked around, trying to find out what happened to his friend. The official story was that David had suffered a nervous breakdown and been transferred to a medical facility in Virginia for treatment. But when Robert tried to call the number he had for David's wife, the number had been disconnected. David Harrison, for all practical purposes, had vanished. That's when Robert realized the true nature of his situation. He wasn't working for a defensive research program. He was part of something far darker, something that the government would do anything to protect, and anyone who threatened to expose it simply disappeared. June of 1969 brought a heat wave to the New Mexico desert that made even the underground facility feel stifling. Robert had been at Project Sentinel for 5 months, and each day felt heavier than the last. He went through the motions of his duties, moving equipment, filing reports, but his mind was somewhere else. He thought about David Harrison constantly, wondered if the man was even still alive. He thought about that creature on the table, wondered how many more existed in facilities scattered across the country. And he thought about his father, who had fought for freedom and justice, who believed in the America that existed in ideals rather than in secret underground bunkers. Robert began to document everything he could, not on paper but in his memory. He memorized names, dates, shipment numbers, anything that might someday serve as evidence if he ever found a way to expose what was happening. He knew it was dangerous, knew that even thinking about breaking his silence could be enough to end up like David. But he couldn't stay silent anymore. He had to do something. In late June, Robert was assigned to escort a civilian consultant through part of the facility. The consultant was a geneticist from MIT named Dr. Sarah Fleming, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. As Robert guided her through the corridors, she asked him questions that seemed casual but felt deliberate. She asked how long he had been at the facility, whether he ever questioned the work being done there, whether he had family waiting for him back home. Robert answered carefully, but he could sense that Dr. Fleming was testing him, trying to figure out if he could be trusted. On their 3rd day together, as they stood in an elevator descending to the lower levels, Dr. Fleming turned to Robert and said something that changed everything. She said that what was happening at Project Sentinel was wrong, that the specimens being held there were not defensive prototypes, but living beings that had been taken from somewhere they should never have been disturbed. She said that people deserved to know the truth, that the American public had a right to understand what their government was doing in their name. Before Robert could respond, the elevator doors opened and Dr. Fleming walked out as if the conversation had never happened. But her words stayed with Robert, echoing in his mind for days afterward. He wanted to trust her, wanted to believe that she was an ally, but he had learned to trust no one. For all he knew, Fleming was working with Crowley, testing his loyalty, seeing if he would take the bait, so Robert did nothing. He kept his head down, kept following orders, kept the secrets that were slowly eating him alive. Then came July 14th, 1969. Robert would remember that date for the rest of his life, not because of what happened to him, but because of what happened to everyone at the facility. Just before midnight, alarms began screaming through the underground complex. Robert was in his quarters when the sound pierced the air, a wailing siren that meant only one thing: containment breach. Major containment breach. He grabbed his gear and ran toward the command center, following the emergency protocols he had been trained for. The corridors were chaos, people running in every direction, some toward the breach and some away from it. Over the intercom system, a voice kept repeating the same instructions. All non-essential personnel evacuate to the surface. All security teams to level 6. This is not a drill. Robert made it to the command center where dozens of personnel were monitoring screens showing different parts of the facility. What he saw on those screens made his earlier glimpse of the creature seem tame by comparison. On level 6, something had gotten loose. Multiple somethings. The camera feeds showed shapes moving through the corridors, things that defied easy description. Some looked almost human, but moved in ways that violated every law of physics. Others were masses of writhing tissue that seemed to exist in multiple places at once, and they were all heading in the same direction, toward the main elevator shaft, toward the surface. The security teams tried to stop them. Robert watched on the monitors as brave men and women engaged these creatures with weapons that seemed laughably inadequate. But the creatures weren't attacking them. They were just trying to get out, trying to escape. And Robert realized in that moment that Dr. Fleming had been right. These weren't weapons being developed. They were prisoners trying to flee their captors. If you've been following along with this story and finding yourself wondering what else the government might be hiding, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We share forgotten stories like this one every week, stories that deserve to be remembered. Now let's get back to Robert and what happened next during that terrifying night in 1969. The containment breach lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of chaos, terror, and desperate attempts to control something that had never should have been contained in the first place. By the time the sun rose over the New Mexico desert on July 15th, the facility had been sealed. Not temporarily closed, but permanently sealed. Concrete was being poured into the elevator shafts. The entrance was being buried under tons of sand and rock, and everyone who had been inside during the breach was being processed, which was the polite way of saying they were being separated, questioned, and having their lives permanently altered. Robert sat in a processing room for 6 hours before Agent Crowley finally appeared. The man looked older than he had 3 months earlier, the weight of the night visible in the lines around his eyes. Crowley sat down across from Robert and laid out several documents on the table between them. The documents outlined Robert's immediate future. He would be honorably discharged from the Air Force with a medical designation related to psychological stress. He would receive a modest pension, enough to live on, but not enough to draw attention. He would be relocated to a city far from New Mexico, given a new job in a civilian capacity, and monitored for the rest of his life. And most importantly, he would never speak about Project Sentinel, about the creatures, about anything that happened in that underground facility. The consequences for breaking silence had been severe before. Now, after the breach, after multiple casualties and the complete abandonment of the facility, the consequences would be absolute. Crowley made it clear that Robert's continued existence depended entirely on his silence. Robert signed the papers. What choice did he have? He thought about refusing, about trying to fight back, but he knew it would be pointless. The people running Project Sentinel had resources, power, and most importantly, the complete support of elements within the government that operated beyond any oversight or accountability. 2 days later, Robert found himself on a bus heading to Seattle, Washington. He had been given an apartment, a job at a shipping company, managing logistics, and a new life that felt like wearing someone else's clothes. For the first few months, he barely left his apartment, except to go to work. He would lie awake at night, hearing the alarms, seeing those shapes moving through the corridors, remembering the look in Dr. Fleming's eyes when she told him that people deserved the truth. Robert tried to adapt to his new life in Seattle. He tried to become the person that the government wanted him to be, a quiet logistics manager who kept to himself and never caused trouble. But forgetting was impossible. Every time he saw a news report about government testing, about classified programs, about military research, he thought about Project Sentinel. He thought about David Harrison and wondered if the man was living a similar half-life somewhere, or if he had ended up buried in the desert. He thought about Dr. Fleming and what had happened to her after the breach. In late 1970, more than a year after the containment breach, Robert received a package at his apartment. There was no return address, just his name written in careful handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside was a single newspaper clipping from a small paper in Massachusetts. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs about a respected geneticist from MIT who had tragically taken her own life after suffering from depression. The geneticist was Dr. Sarah Fleming. Robert stared at that clipping for hours, reading and rereading those few paragraphs. The article said Fleming had left no note that she had been found in her home by concerned colleagues. The official story was suicide. But Robert knew better. He knew that Dr. Fleming had tried to do something, tried to expose what was happening, and she had been silenced permanently. The message was clear. This is what happens to people who talk. This is what happens to heroes who try to do the right thing. For the next several years, Robert existed rather than lived. He went to work, came home, repeated the cycle. He dated occasionally, but never let anyone get close enough to ask the right questions. He called his parents in Sacramento every few weeks, lying about how well he was doing, how much he loved Seattle, how happy he was with his civilian life. His father, who had been so proud when Robert joined the Air Force, never understood why his son had left the military so suddenly. Robert could hear the confusion in his father's voice during those phone calls, the unasked questions about what had gone wrong. But Robert could never explain. He could never tell his father that the country they both loved, the country they had both served, was capable of such darkness. In 1975, Robert was watching the evening news when a story came on that made him freeze in place. The report was about newly declassified documents related to government testing programs from the 1950s and 1960s. Projects with names like MK Ultra, where the government had experimented on unwitting citizens, testing drugs and psychological techniques without consent or oversight. The reporter was explaining how Congress was now investigating these programs, how there were calls for accountability and transparency. For a moment, Robert felt hope. If they were exposing these programs, maybe there was a chance that Project Sentinel could be exposed too. Maybe he could finally tell his story, finally unburden himself of the secret that was slowly crushing him. But then, the report ended with a statement from a government spokesman. The spokesman assured the public that such programs were a thing of the past, that current oversight prevented any such abuses from happening today. The spokesman said that the government had learned from its mistakes and that American citizens could trust that their safety and rights were being protected. Robert turned off the television and sat in the darkness of his apartment. He realized then that nothing would change. Even if some programs were exposed, even if some officials were held accountable, there would always be others, deeper projects, darker secrets that would never see the light of day. Project Sentinel would never be declassified. The creatures in that facility would never be acknowledged, and people like David Harrison and Dr. Fleming would never be remembered as the heroes they were. Robert made a decision that night. If he couldn't expose the truth, if he couldn't bring justice to those who deserved it, he could at least honor their memory in his own way. He started keeping a journal, not about Project Sentinel directly, but about the people he had known, the moments that mattered. He wrote about David, showing him pictures of his kids, about Dr. Fleming's courage in speaking up, about the junior scientists who had tried to do good work even while being part of something terrible. He wrote knowing that the journal might be found, that writing anything down was a risk. But he needed something, some record that these people had existed, had mattered, had tried to do the right thing even when the system they served was doing wrong. The years passed slowly for Robert. He watched America change around him, watched the country go through Watergate, through the end of the Vietnam War, through recessions and recoveries. He watched technology advance, watched as the world became more connected, watched as information became easier to share. And with each passing year, he wondered if the time would ever come when he could tell his story. In 1982, Robert's father passed away from a heart attack. Robert returned to Sacramento for the funeral, standing beside his mother and sister as they lowered his father into the ground. The military honor guard folded the flag and presented it to his mother, thanking her for her husband's service to the nation. Robert held his mother as she cried, and he felt the weight of all the things he could never tell her about service, about sacrifice, about what it really meant to give everything for your country. During the reception after the funeral, one of his father's old friends from the 432nd approached Robert. The old veteran had tears in his eyes as he talked about Robert's father, about the battles they had fought together, about the men who had died so that others could be free. The veteran told Robert that his father had been so proud of him, had talked constantly about his son, the Air Force officer. Then the veteran asked Robert something that cut like a knife. He asked why Robert had left the military, asked if something had happened, asked if Robert was okay. Robert wanted to tell him, wanted to explain that he had seen things that challenged everything his father had believed in, that the country they had both served was capable of darkness that would horrify them both. But instead, Robert just smiled and said that military life hadn't been for him, that he was happy in Seattle, that everything was fine. The veteran nodded but looked unconvinced. As he walked away, Robert realized that this was his punishment. Not prison, not death, but living a lie forever. Being unable to share the truth with the people who deserved to hear it most. The 1990s brought new hope to Robert in an unexpected way. The internet was becoming mainstream, and with it came the possibility of anonymous communication, of sharing information without revealing your identity. Robert watched as whistleblowers began using the internet to expose government wrongdoing, watched as classified documents started appearing on websites beyond the government's easy control. He began to wonder if, maybe finally, he could find a way to share what he knew without signing his own death warrant. But every time he came close to taking that step, something would remind him of the reach of the people he was dealing with. A car that seemed to follow him for a few days before disappearing. A phone call where no one spoke, just breathing on the other end of the line. Small things that could have been coincidence but felt like warnings. Robert was being watched. Even after 30 years, even after living a quiet, unremarkable life, someone was making sure he remembered his place. In 1999, Robert turned 54 years old. He had spent more of his life keeping the secret than he had spent before learning it. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw an old man, someone who had let fear control every decision for 3 decades. He thought about all the things he could have done, should have done, to honor David Harrison and Dr. Fleming and all the others who had suffered because of Project Sentinel. That year, Robert tried something different. He wrote a letter, carefully worded, never mentioning Project Sentinel directly, but alluding to classified programs from 1969 that the public deserved to know about. He sent copies to 3 different journalists, respected reporters who had broken major stories about government misconduct. He waited for responses, hoped that maybe one of them would be curious enough to dig deeper. Only one journalist responded, and the response was brief. The reporter said that without concrete evidence, without verifiable details, there was nothing to investigate. Allegations about secret programs from 30 years ago were impossible to pursue without documents, without other witnesses willing to come forward. The reporter thanked Robert for reaching out, but suggested he might be misremembering events or exaggerating their significance. The new millennium came and went. Robert retired from his logistics job in 2004, receiving a gold watch and a small party with colleagues who barely knew him. He had spent 35 years in Seattle without forming any deep connections, without leaving any real mark on the world around him. He was a ghost, alive but invisible, present but forgotten. In his retirement, Robert spent most of his time reading, following the news, watching as the world continued to change. He saw new scandals emerge, saw new whistleblowers step forward, saw some of them celebrated and others destroyed for their courage. He followed the story of Edward Snowden in 2013 with particular interest, watching as a young man threw away his entire life to expose government surveillance programs. Robert admired Snowden's courage, even as he recognized the terrible price the man would pay. Snowden at least had documents, had evidence, had the ability to prove what he was saying. Robert had nothing but memories and a story that would sound insane to anyone who heard it. In 2015, Robert was diagnosed with early-stage lung disease, a consequence of spending too much time in the underground facility, breathing recycled air contaminated with who knows what. The doctor said it was manageable, that with treatment, he could live for many more years, but Robert knew that time was running out. He was 70 years old, and the secret he had carried for 46 years was becoming heavier with each passing day. He started writing more in his journal, being more explicit about Project Sentinel, about the creatures, about the containment breach. He knew he was violating the agreements he had signed, knew he was putting himself at risk. But what could they do to him now? He was an old man, dying slowly from the very service they had forced him into. If they wanted to silence him permanently, let them try. At least then his death would mean something. But nothing happened. No agents appeared at his door. No threatening phone calls came. It was as if the people who had controlled his life for so long had simply lost interest, or perhaps decided that an old man's ravings were no longer a threat worth eliminating. In early 2019, 50 years after the containment breach, Robert made a decision. He contacted a small independent journalist who specialized in investigating forgotten government programs. The journalist, a woman in her 30s named Jessica Liu, agreed to meet with him at a coffee shop in Seattle. Robert showed her his journal, showed her the documents he still had from his time in the Air Force, told her everything about Project Sentinel. Jessica listened carefully, took notes, asked intelligent questions. When Robert finished his story, Jessica was quiet for a long moment. Then she told him the truth. Without physical evidence, without other witnesses, without any official documentation of Project Sentinel's existence, there was no way to verify his story. She believed him, she said, could hear the truth in his voice, could see the weight of his secret in his eyes. But belief wasn't enough. In the modern media landscape, without proof, his story would be dismissed as the delusions of an old man, or worse, as conspiracy theory nonsense that would damage any outlet that published it. Jessica suggested that Robert submit a Freedom of Information Act request for documents related to his service in 1969. Maybe, she said, something would turn up, some reference to the facility or to Project Sentinel that could give his story credibility. Robert filed the request, knowing it was probably futile, but needing to try anyway. 6 months later, he received a response. The Department of Defense acknowledged his service in the Air Force, but stated that records from the period and location he specified had been destroyed in a facility fire in 1985. There was nothing to provide, no documents to declassify, no evidence that Project Sentinel had ever existed. Robert wasn't surprised. Of course, the records had been destroyed. Of course, every trace of the program had been erased. The people running these operations were thorough, had decades of experience in making inconvenient truths disappear. But what did surprise Robert was how defeated he felt. He had always known the truth would likely die with him. But having it confirmed, having that final door closed, made the weight of his silence feel unbearable. In the fall of 2019, Robert's health began to decline more rapidly. The lung disease was progressing, and his doctors suggested more aggressive treatment. But Robert refused. He was tired of fighting, tired of living half a life, tired of carrying a burden that no one would ever acknowledge. He decided to spend his remaining time writing, recording everything he could remember about Project Sentinel, about the people he had known, about the truth that would never be officially recognized. He wrote for his own sake, for the sake of having a complete record, even if no one would ever read it. He wrote about the technology in the facility, about the strange equipment he had seen, about conversations he had overheard between scientists. He wrote about the creatures, describing them in as much detail as memory allowed, knowing that his descriptions would sound like science fiction, but needing to document them anyway. And he wrote about the human cost. About David Harrison and his 2 kids who grew up without a father. About Dr. Sarah Fleming and her courage to speak truth to power. About all the junior personnel who had served at Project Sentinel, never knowing the full scope of what they were part of. In his final entry, written in late November 2019, Robert addressed whoever might someday read his journal. He wrote that he had tried to be a good soldier, had tried to serve his country with honor like his father before him. But he had learned that sometimes honor means breaking the rules, means disobeying orders, means choosing truth over loyalty. He wrote that his greatest regret was not having Dr. Fleming's courage, not speaking up when it mattered, not fighting harder to expose what he had witnessed. He wrote that he hoped somehow, someday, the truth about Project Sentinel would emerge, that the creatures in that facility would be acknowledged, that the people who had been silenced would be remembered. Robert Chen passed away on December 3, 2019, at the age of 74. His death certificate listed respiratory failure as the cause of death. He died alone in his apartment in Seattle, with no family present, no friends to mourn him. The building manager found him 3 days later when neighbors complained about a smell. His few possessions were boxed up and sent to his sister in California, who had barely spoken to him in years and barely remembered the brother who had once been so full of promise. Among Robert's possessions was his journal, 40 years of careful documentation about Project Sentinel and everything he had witnessed. His sister flipped through it briefly, saw the strange drawings of creatures, read a few passages about underground facilities and government secrets, and assumed her brother had become paranoid and delusional in his final years. She considered throwing the journal away, but ultimately decided to donate it along with his other papers to a local historical society that collected military memorabilia. The journal sat in a storage box at the Historical Society for 2 years, unread and unexamined. It might have stayed there forever, forgotten like Robert himself, except for a graduate student researching Cold War-era military personnel for her dissertation. The student, going through boxes of donated materials, found Robert's journal and began to read. She was struck by the level of detail, by the consistency of the narrative, by the genuine anguish in Robert's words. She showed the journal to her dissertation advisor, who showed it to a colleague who specialized in classified government programs. That colleague reached out to Jessica Liu, the journalist who had met with Robert years earlier. Jessica, now working for a larger publication, decided to investigate. She filed her own FOIA requests, contacted retired military personnel who had served in New Mexico in 1969, searched through declassified documents for any reference to Project Sentinel or unusual research facilities. She found nothing concrete, but she found gaps, inconsistencies in official records that suggested something had been deliberately erased. In the spring of 2023, Jessica published an article about Robert Chen and his claims about Project Sentinel. The article was careful, presenting Robert's story as an unsolved mystery rather than proven fact. But it also raised serious questions about government accountability, about the fate of personnel who had served in classified programs, about the limits of public oversight when it came to military research. The article generated some interest, was shared on social media, discussed in some online forums dedicated to government conspiracy theories. But it didn't go viral, didn't spark any major investigations, didn't lead to any official acknowledgement of Project Sentinel's existence. Most people who read it assumed Robert had been mentally ill or that he had been part of some mundane classified program that his memory had distorted over decades into something more dramatic. And maybe that's what the people in charge wanted. Not complete silence, but enough noise and uncertainty that the truth remained buried under layers of doubt and speculation. Robert Chen's name never appeared in any list of American heroes. He received no medals, no recognition, No acknowledgement of his service or his sacrifice. His story remains unverified, his claims unproven, his legacy uncertain. But for those who have read his journal, for those who have studied the gaps in the historical record, for those who understand how governments operate when they don't want truth to emerge, Robert Chen represents something important. He represents every person who has witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, who has been forced into silence by threats and intimidation, who has carried a secret so heavy that it destroys their ability to live a normal life. He represents the cost of keeping secrets, the human toll of classified programs that operate beyond any meaningful oversight. And he represents a question that America has never adequately answered. What happens to the heroes who serve their country faithfully, only to discover that their country is doing something they cannot in good conscience support? What happens when duty and morality conflict, when the orders you're given violate everything you believe in? Robert Chen tried to navigate that impossible situation, tried to find a way to honor both his oath of service and his sense of right and wrong. Whether he succeeded or failed is not for us to judge. What matters is that he tried, that he spent 50 years carrying a burden that would have broken most people, that even in his isolation and silence, he tried to document the truth for future generations. Whatever really happened at Project Sentinel, whatever those creatures were, whatever experiments the government was conducting in that underground facility in New Mexico, the truth died with Robert and the others who served there. The official records have been destroyed. The witnesses have been silenced. The facility itself has been buried under tons of concrete and sand, erased from the landscape as thoroughly as it was erased from history. But stories like Robert's remind us that history is written by those who survived to tell it, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones that powerful people work hardest to suppress. We may never know exactly what Robert Chen witnessed in 1969, may never have definitive proof that Project Sentinel existed, may never be able to honor him as the hero he tried to be. But we can remember that he tried to tell the truth, and that alone deserves recognition in a world where truth is often the most dangerous thing you can speak.